Will artificial intelligence actually hurt the US economy? Now, AI optimists often point to a world where the rise of AI leads to a productivity boom and a huge expansion in economic growth. But in today's video, I'm going to show you why the public isn't necessarily buying that message and show you some data that shows they could be wrong. First, we're going to start with a conversation around data centers. So recently, you may have seen that New York passed a 1-year moratorium ban on new data centers being built. That drew the attention of President Trump, who put out this Truth Social post with his normal flair. I'm just going to point you to the last sentence where he says both the taxes and the jobs amount to liquid gold. And that's part of what we're going to explore in today's video. We're going to start with a quick data center legislation update. So where do the states stand on the data center issue? We're going to talk about why do people actually hate AI and data centers? And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the economic piece. So do data centers actually lead to new jobs? And will AI lead to sustained broad economic growth? So again, quick stop here at the data legislative map. Now, if you notice in the bottom left, you'll see a logo you haven't seen before, most likely. It says bipartisan. I recently launched a new newsletter on LinkedIn that covers the intersection of policy and financial markets. So here we are often talking about just macro. It's a lot of monetary policy. I also wanted to create a space to talk more about political policy and how that impacts the macro landscape and different macro regimes. So if you're looking for more longer form written content, that's where you're going to find that. It is in bipartisan on LinkedIn. If you connect with me, I think it will automatically ask you to follow the newsletter. So if you're interested, you can find me there. But let's look at this map. So ban enacted, just one state, and that is New York. It is a 1-year pause on any new building of data centers. If you look at some of the states that are dark blue on this map, they have passed some other form of legislation. Normally, this is around things like needing to bring your own power. So these data centers aren't connecting into the grid, or something around the lines of like water use rules. Then you have pending moratoriums in places like Maryland, Oklahoma, and Vermont. And then in Maine, actually, the legislature passed a 1-year moratorium, but that was vetoed by Governor Janet Mills. So states are doing a wide array of things. And why are they acting right now? Well, that's because voters have largely soured on data centers. So this was a poll from Politico. They did this poll in January. They redid it in July to see how people changed their opinions over time. I took the data specifically on the question, would you support a data center being built in your immediate community? Now, as you can see in January, all the way here on the left, there was actually net positive support. So 37% said they would support a data center being built in their community compared to 28% that would oppose. Then obviously there's a huge proportion here that says they don't know or neither, whatever that other option was. But you look at July and it's been a huge shift to oppose. It's actually 13% in each direction. So from 37% down to 24% supporting, and then from 28% up to 41% being opposed. Now you might ask, is this purely a political issue? Well, this shift has been seen across both Harris and Trump voters. Now they're from different starting points. So Harris voters in January, it was about split 50-50 whether they would support or oppose. And now, as you can see in July, it is a huge majority of people that voted for Kamala Harris in the last election that would oppose a data center being built in their community. Then you look at Trump voters, there was a huge majority of support in January. And that has now shifted to more of the 50-50 that we saw in January with the Harris voters. So starting at different points, but the overall shift has been consistent. People across the political spectrum, are souring on data centers being built in their community. And why are they concerned? Well, there's a few major concerns I can say. It's electricity use. So we have seen electricity prices spike in certain communities and states where there has been a lot of data centers built. So that has been number one. It's directly impacted people's pockets and wallets. Also, land use. Some of these projects are massive and take up a lot of land. And then also water use. Now, this one's a little, I don't want to say controversial, but compared to golf courses, they use less water, but still people don't want to put things into their community that they already think is a net negative that is then going to use a lot of water to cool itself. Here, I just took the chart of the projected shift in demand in terawatt hours for electricity based on different categories. And as you can see, from 2020 to 2025, data centers used less than industry in general when it comes to electricity. And that's going to completely flip, or is projected to flip in 2025 to 2030. Data centers are now projected to use quite a lot of electricity compared to these other categories. So that is a concern, that if these come into the local communities, it is going to cause electricity prices to spike. And that is why you're seeing some of the legislation about new data centers being built have to actually bring their own power. So they're not tapping into the grid. They are their own power source and they use their own power. And again, the thought is that it will alleviate some of these concerns about rising electricity prices. So people hate data centers, but how do they feel about AI? And overall, I would sum it up as despite major concerns about the ultimate impacts of AI on society and the economy, AI is becoming increasingly widely used. So this is from a Gallup poll here on the left. Again, they tracked the amount of people that have been using AI over time. And in their most recent polling, it hit 50% for the first time of total people polled that use AI with some regularity. Now, if you go in deeper, you can see daily AI users is up around 13, 14%. Frequent AI users is nearing 30%. And again, around half of people polled are now using AI. But they are still concerned about it. So if you look at this chart on the right from the Pew Research Center, this is by year, and you can see that people are much more concerned about AI than they are excited. Now, most people here, right, only 10-ish% of people over the last few years have been more excited than concerned about AI's impact on society, where, 90% of people that are polled are either more concerned or they're equally concerned versus excited. So, despite huge reservations about the future of AI, people are still using it. Now, let's get into the economic components of this. So, do data centers actually create local jobs? Now, this has been a huge debate. There's been a lot of competing research here. In particular, there's one often quoted project in Nevada that I believe created 4,000 temporary construction jobs, but only 73 permanent jobs. And so the anti-data center people often point to that. Yes, you get a short-term construction job boom, but overall, you don't see huge permanent job increases once these data center projects are actually finished. Well, the Brookings Institution actually looked at this. We have enough data now to look at multiple years after data centers are built and how the job market in that local community changes. And what they did, which is what most people don't do, is they control for the trend in job growth leading up to the data center being built. So they tried to isolate what is the actual impact of the data center itself, as opposed to did it just, it was the area increasing already and a data center got built and it stayed on that same trend. And what they found was there was a positive increase in local jobs created. Their number they found was 4%. Now, it might be a little hard to see here, but it's the top left of the four charts, total private employment. And again, there's a huge range here, almost from 2% up to 6% is their confidence interval. But what they found was around 4% 6 years after a data center opens. Construction, 11%. Information sector, 22%. But again, look how wide these confidence intervals are. It's all the way down from 8% all the way up to 40%. So there's not a lot of confidence in this specific number. And then professional services as well. So there's some important caveats here, however, because not all data center projects and not all cities are created equal. So their overall point, their overall finding was data centers do create jobs, but it's far fewer than industry advocates claim. And you could probably also say the reverse. This is definitely higher than people who are against these data centers being built would probably claim. Number two, these last two, I think, are the more important points to be made. Hyperscalers create jobs, while landlords do not. So when Amazon, Meta, you name the big company, is coming in and building its own data center, those are the data centers that tend to increase long-term permanent jobs. However, companies that are building data centers and then leasing the compute out, those do not really create jobs. So a lot of this job gain has come specifically from the data centers being built by these hyperscalers and not the ones that are just looking to sell the compute. That is a big, big, big difference in their data. So if you were a state or city looking at this, you would rather have Amazon or Meta building a data center and not one of the companies that just leases out the compute. And then finally, single facilities produce very modest employment gains, regardless of whether it's a hyperscaler or not. You start to see the actual impacts once you get multiple facilities. So if you have campuses of data centers, again, I wonder if that's sort of related to the hyperscaler concept where they're building multiple. But if it's only one facility, you're not seeing a huge boost in jobs. It's when you get multiple facilities in one area that you start to build a little bit of a data center ecosystem, and that in itself leads to more jobs. And then what about the economic growth piece? The last three sides, that's what we're going to cover. So will AI lead to economic growth? Now there's two main questions here. There is, will this CapEx that we're seeing being spent on data centers lead to increases in productivity? And then will that productivity lead to economic growth? So let's answer that first question here. And the relationship still seems intact. So if you look at US CapEx investment here in blue on the left axis, and then US productivity here in the right, you can see productivity appears to be rising alongside CapEx. And that's what we've seen from the research and the data thus far. We are seeing a minor increase in US productivity. And a lot of people credit that to this CapEx spend, to the growth of AI. Now, I imagine a lot of those AI optimistic projections are being overly optimistic about the productivity increases we've seen thus far, but the data does show that US productivity is higher. So that's question number one. Question number two is, will that productivity increase lead to economic growth? So I went back and looked through history about the relationship between US productivity and US GDP growth, and the story was a bit confusing. So for about 15 years, from 1952 to 1966, there was a meaningful positive relationship between US productivity growth and US GDP growth. The R squared was about 0.36, which, when you think about all of the factors that could be playing into both of these things, that is a pretty high number. But then from 1966 all the way to 2019, what we found was no meaningful relationship between the two. I mean, you can see that from the scatter here. It looks like what we call a shotgun blast, random pellets all over the place. Now, I stopped this before COVID because COVID really skewed this data and shows that in the last few years, productivity increases have actually been related to decreases in GDP. That could be true, but not enough data is out yet to draw any meaningful conclusions from the post-COVID period. So I felt more comfortable stopping it at 2019. But the point of these two charts is to say more modern economic history shows us that the link between productivity and GDP growth is not as strong as many might assume. And then finally, this chart is probably the most interesting, I would say. So, does technology and productivity actually hurt the economy? And so, what this chart is, it's the correlation between US GDP growth and US productivity growth, 10 years rolling. And what you see is that there's actually a negative correlation. So, this is a little bit of what I talked about, where productivity growth leads to negative GDP growth. There is a negative correlation since about the mid 2000s, late 2000s, you might say, between productivity growth and GDP growth. Productivity's influence on GDP declined sharply in the 1990s as the internet emerged. We saw a little bit of a spike, but then things really turned negative in the late 2000s as technology began to cannibalize GDP. And then this is a lot of what Andrew Yang was actually talking about during his presidential campaign. So I have a quote here from him. Automation is no longer just a problem for those working in manufacturing. Physical labor was replaced by robots. Mental labor is going to be replaced by AI and software. And so this is really that concern in a chart. The main question here with AI and productivity growth is, will this lead to broad economic growth? Now, a lot of people, AI optimists in general, assume this is a given. If we see productivity growth, the US economy is going to benefit. However, more recent data throws caution into those assumptions. I would not take it as a given that if AI leads to increases in productivity, that necessarily leads to broad economic growth. And on that positive message, I am going to leave you this week. So, apologies for a bit of a longer video, but there's a lot to cover. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, it would be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. And I will see you back next week for another Macro Monday video.